Thank you very much for the invitation, and I suppose I'm here to speak. It's very much an antidote to Dr. Ian White's paper about abolition. We know Scotland has got a very disproportionate role in abolition, but my work over the last 17 years, we've just been reminiscing there, has involved trying to uncover much more about Glasgow's connections with slavery, particularly financial, economic, but it's also evolved into studies about pro-slave trade and pro-slavery movements. So I'll talk you through some of the groups today, a West India club, but also particularly a West India association. I'll also have a think about some of the big major figures. And we see up here, we see two enslavers, James Ewan of Strathleven, the de facto head of Glasgow's West India interest, James Buchanan of Moray Place, both of them. Ewan is a classic absentee in that he owns enslaved people in a plantation in Jamaica, but he never ever visits. He extracts the wealth. But James Buchanan is a bit different. He's the son of a farrier in the Trongate, but he goes to three separate slavery societies. He goes to Jamaica, Grenada first, then he goes to Jamaica, and then ultimately he goes to Brazil. He retires aged 37. And he comes back with a huge fortune. Both of them are amongst the richest of all Glasgow's enslavers. The common theme that they do have is that they're involved in philanthropic initiatives through the Merchant's House, which explains why up to fairly recently they were represented as these Roman gods. Once I published the book, The Glasgow Sugar Aristocracy, in 2022, the Merchant's House removed the statues. I'm now told they have put them back up with some recontextualisation from our friend, Sir Jeff Palmer. So just following on from Ian's point, we do see in Glasgow it's a microcosm of this paradox. There's a mercantile paradox. We've got the Scottish Enlightenment figures who are writing against slavery, particularly Francis Hutcheson, Francis Hutcheson, Adam Smith, and then John Miller. There's a trajectory there at Old College. Everybody associates the Scottish Enlightenment with Edinburgh. The spiritual home of the Scottish Enlightenment is, of course, Old College, the University of Glasgow. But there is a mercantile paradox here, in that these philosophers, these philosophes, particularly Hutcheson, are writing the first moral critique of chattel slavery, and that they're saying it's morally wrong. But at the same time, the city is polluted by those with pro-slavery interests. We have numerous returned Caribbean sojourners, that is temporary economic migrants, such as the McDowells. They're going to the Caribbean and accumulating great wealth, coming back, they're reshaping Glasgow, such as through the Shawfield Mansion, and of course it's in Glassford Street, which we've seen the pupils have done a remarkable job of contextualising the streets. But also the tobacco lords, very famously the golden age of tobacco, 1740 to 1790. And these men, of course, are memorialised in streets as well as their mansions, the Cunningham Mansion, the Virginia Mansion, we have Glassford Street, etc., etc. But the sugar aristocracy, up to fairly recently, have received much less scholarly attention, and that became my focus when I started a PhD back in 2010 at the University of Glasgow. So with these successive generations of those with strong pro-slavery connections, economic, financial, and political. But at the same time, this paradox is centred in and around which today is the High Street. For those of you that know, the original situation of the University of Glasgow was where the train station is today. The pro-slave trade movement, the pro-slavery movement would have been centred at the Tontine, and that would have been next to what is now the Tron Steeple. The Tontine Rooms, the Tontine Hotel, this was very much the gang hut of the tobacco lords. It's the social and commercial headquarters of the city. So at the same time you're seeing these philosophers, and we heard from Ian's paper, there's political opposition to the slave trade, including the University of Glasgow, of course, petitioned the first civic institution in 1792 against the perpetuation of the slave trade. But we're seeing pro-slavery and pro-slave trade movements, and I will talk you through some of those movements just now. Wrong way. So I think just a qualifier here, and that to explain Scotland's just the broad contours of Scottish involvement with the slave trade and plantation slavery. It's unusual compared to England, Wales, and Ireland. First of all, there is very limited direct involvement in what is known as the triangular trade voyages. They think there's only 31 Scottish slave trade voyages. 27 of them would have left Scottish ports between 1706 and 1766. For example, Liverpool sent out 1,000 voyages in a 10-year period after 1790. So Scottish involvement direct with the slave trade is tiny by comparison English ports. But where Scots come to monopolise is plantation connections, and particularly the Caribbean. Mercantile connections as well, of course, they monopolise the trade in tobacco, but Scots in a big way are involved in the Caribbean. And we know this when slavery is abolished in 1834, Scots as compensation claimants who are receiving compensation for the loss of their property, the lives of the enslaved, are disproportionately overrepresented in a way that is unusual compared to Ireland, Wales and even England. So Scots were major owners of enslaved people. We also think that Scotland is an underdeveloped society in the 1690s. The Union is transformative, and Tom Devine's argument since is that did slavery make Scotia great? Scotland's commercial, industrial and agricultural revolutions are concomitant, and it means that slavery has a disproportionate effect on the economic development of Scotland, and this is unusual in a British context. So how did these men react? We know that they are, I'm leaving out the tobacco lords here. Of course, the American Revolution in 1776 knocks out the tobacco trade, but I'm focusing on the Caribbean today and in the slave trade. How do these men organise? Well, it's these social and commercial clubs, and I'll come back to the clubs in a minute, but this West India Club is unusual in that it seems to be social and commercial at the same time, and that it is a bit political because we think they're sending petitions. We don't have any minutes that exist. Perhaps they never existed, but I mean they certainly don't exist today. They're not known to historians. But the West India Club, we do see the membership represented in like Glasgow's trade directories, and we can start to look at some of the membership, and it is given us the names of the membership, the Houstons, the Bogles. These are some of the big major mercantile figures. Some of them were formerly tobacco lords, but some of them clearly, after the American Revolution knocks out the tobacco trade, there is a commercial refocus right into the Caribbean, and we can see this at the beginning. So some of the famous names there, John Gordon, John Campbell Sr., Robert Mackay, we're seeing them also petitioning. They're behind the reshaping of the tontine. The lobbying the City Council to put forward, they want sugar sampling rooms, and this is indicative of the shift from tobacco to sugar. So I think the question, can we pose the question, is Glasgow really pro-slave trade at all? And we've heard from Ian's work, there's numerous disproportionate petitions, including from Church of Scotland ministers and the Heritors, petitioning against the continuation of the slave trade. But you would think with Glasgow's strong connections with pro-slavery movement, they would have had a much more significant role in actually supporting slavery. Actually, that doesn't seem to be the case, and we can see that through petitions. I would say that there's dozens of pro-slave trade petitions and anti-abolition petitions sent when Wilberforce brings it on the agenda, 1787, 1792, the same year, incidentally, that Muir is writing his thesis, or he's defending his thesis in 1787, is the year that the abolitionist movement really kicks off. But what you do see is the pro-slave trade movements are coalescing. And some of the numbers I have there, 6 pro-slave or anti-abolition pro-slave trade petitions are received from Bristol, in the Houses of Parliament. Liverpool merchants, of course, they're directly implicated. It's the leading slave trade port in Europe. They're sending 64. But only one was received from Glasgow. It's tiny. We need to say that the last slave trade voyage is 1766, so it's coming 20 years after Glasgow was involved with the slave trade. However, we do know from the content of the petition that the Glasgow merchants are still in support of the slave trade continuing, because it would obviously supply their estates in the Caribbean. We also know that there is the gradual abolition, as Ian said earlier. Henry Dundas is behind the amendment, gradual abolition. It means that the abolition of the slave trade is delayed for 15 years. We think there's some collectivisation with the Glasgow merchants. They're collectivising money from the planters, some of them in the Highlands, and they're sending money to the London West India Committee, which is the premier pro-slave trade organisation. Now we know, of course, the slave trade's abolished in 1807. I don't think we can characterise Glasgow as a pro-slave trade city at this point, even if the merchants are involved in the Caribbean in a big way. But what we do see is there's this associational culture in mercantile Glasgow. We have a number of these different social clubs. They're designed for the improvement of members as they saw it, exemplified by this, the Hodgepodge Club is very famous. The Minutes do exist, still exist today. It's limited access. The perhaps appropriately named Pig Club is the club for the West India merchants and planters. Again, we don't have any minutes. What we do have is John Strang's account, Glasgow and its clubs, so we can start to have a think about how these clubs operated. The Board of Green Cloth, again, the minutes, the printed minutes survive, and we can start to see, they're there, they're drinking rum, they're gambling, they're playing whist, they're betting in imperial wars. It's like very elite gentlemen clubs for the local elites, that is merchants, politicians. This would have been, you could be blackballed from membership. This was very, very high level. The most work I've done in the minutes survive in Glasgow City Archives is on the Glasgow Gaelic Club. That started initially to promote Gaelic culture and language in Glasgow, but ultimately there is a mercantile takeover, I think, from about the 1790s. Initially you had to speak Gaelic, that was the terms. I think by the 1790s they changed the remit that you just had to be interested in the Highlands. So what happened is all the Highland estate owners, the West India merchants, then just take it over. And to me it's a platform for networking. They're using the Gaelic Club in a certain way, and we know that the John Campbell Senior and Co, the family really take over it. There's numerous Campbells, which incidentally makes it really difficult to work in the minutes because they don't often give first names, and there's like 10 Campbells at one meeting, and you're like, well, if you're studying the Campbell family, that's no use to me. But we also see that the return sojourners, these Highland planters are coming back, and all of them are going through the Gaelic Club. But when we really see Glasgow's pro-slavery agenda really developing is through the Glasgow-West India Association. This is formed in 1807, and it becomes probably the most strongest outport association. I should say that the minutes are fantastically preserved in Glasgow City Archives. They're better minutes than the Bristol and the Liverpool versions. They're much more comprehensive. But we know that the two set of records, we can really get an idea of all these merchants and planters who are becoming involved. And incidentally, this was the basis of the PhD I did in 2010. I transcribed the minutes, I looked at every member, I looked at all the firms that were involved. I was able to get a big, strong group. I think over 100, I think about 150 names I got from the West India Association minutes, and then I could start to trace their wealth, their fortunes and death. But in some ways it was like a typical association. They're meeting quarterly, they're meeting in the tontine, they're lobbying, they're starting these committees. James Ewan, as we've seen at the start, is one of the main players. But they're petitioning Parliament, they're putting forward, of course the slave trade is already abolished by the time they're established, but they are then put forward a pro-slavery offensive, which I'll come back to. And that's just some of the minutes there today. And this is an abstract, this is the first set. I think they commissioned the worst handwriter in Glasgow to rewrite the minutes in 1867. So, but that just gives you an idea of the names that are there. So I think its features, I think I started to go through and I started to think, how many of these men are like active, how many of them turned up. The abstract doesn't actually tell you who attends minutes at a certain time, so it was quite difficult to see who turned up. But we start to see some of them who are subscribing, some of them are providing money, some of them are taking leadership roles like James Ewan, Charles Stewart Parker, they're becoming chairman, directors, traditional committee structure. Active membership as well. I think maybe about 30% of membership would have been turning up at certain times. But bearing in mind, these are the richest men in Scotland at the same time. They've got huge Caribbean slavery-derived fortunes. But I think the fundamental point here is this is a small group of men, a very small group of elite wealthy men with direct interest in the Caribbean who are shaping Glasgow's pro-slavery strategies. I won't bore you with numbers too much here, but this is just some of what I started to do then was looking at who these men were. where they started to trade with, and I started to get an idea of colonial interests. So you can start to see, Jamaica, the Jamaica merchants were, they were the most prominent, and that's to be expected. But also Trinidad, we can see Demerara, Grenada, and what I started to do was measure that, the first subscribers to the association versus subsequent subscribers. So Jamaica, that is expected. Glasgow's, and in fact Scotland's, premier association with the Caribbean is Jamaica. But James Ewan is the main player, and this is the picture of him that is up in the Merchant's House. He's the son of a West India arbiter in Glasgow. I think they own Cathkin House. It's probably their organ. I'm sure Glaswegians will give me a wee pat on the back of my geography there. But he's certainly operating in Glasgow, his father. He attends Old College. He's very precocious. I think he goes to Glasgow High School and then Old College, aged 13 or 14. But he becomes this leading influence on the Glasgow-West India Association. He becomes very politically influential as well. Lord Provost, he's the first MP after the Reform Act in 1832. And he's also Dean of Guild, I think, at least a couple of times. So he successfully converts his financial interest in the Caribbean into political influence. And we know he collects compensation for enslaved people in 1834 for enslaved people in Camanachs, and I'll come back to that in a minute. I should say, just a wee digress here, he's one of when the University of Glasgow commissioned the study in 2018, James Ewan was one of the bequests that come up. So I knew, I had visited Ewan's plantation, as we can see there in 2014 when I was there in research. So I had then had to identify the bequests, how much money that was worth to the University of Glasgow up to present day. Then I had to phone the accountancy team. So they said to me, do you have a budget code? I said, well, I don't, but I've got slave owners' names. So then we had to go through a process of elimination about these Ewan, and there's a few of them. And then we came to a realisation. I mean, I think that was one of, a surreal point in, my research career is Caribbean slavery has got a budget code in British institutions. The University of Glasgow is not unusual in this. This is all over. This is the financial reality of slavery. There is a budget code for the Ewan Gold Medal today. Incidentally, they just changed its name. It's no longer the Ewan Medal. But that's Camanachs there in 2014. So I think one of the successes of the West India Association was the capitalisation of it. They were able to accumulate great money. The sugar sample rooms was the Royal Exchange. It's now Gallery Modern Art. That was their base. They shifted for the tontine on up to the Royal Exchange. They used some of their income. We think about 3% of their annual income, which is relatively small, but they used that in propaganda through the Glasgow Courier. They're also contributing pro-slavery subscriptions, if you like, to the London West India Committee. So there is a national pro-slavery movement that Glasgow is one part. Definitely they used the power of the media, and particularly James McQueen. He's the vociferous demagogue in charge of the Glasgow Courier, the editor. He's actually from Lanarkshire. He's from Malway, up Crawford, from North Lanarkshire. But he goes to Grenada in the 1790s. He's staunchly anti-Catholic, doesn't like the French, doesn't like enslaved people either, but comes back and he's actually a very skilled propagandist. He's a very skilled statistician as well, and he's putting forward arguments that slavery, of course, is a good thing for the Scottish economy and the British economy, and that they would be foolhardy to abolish it. He goes for an ad hominem approach, particularly the Reverend Ralph Wardlaw. They're criticising the leading abolitionists in print. This is a very vicious debate with the Glasgow Courier at the top of it. So McQueen is a very nasty man, and we think he was probably paid up to about £15,000 by the pro-slavery bodies. For comparison, the average wage of a cotton spinner in, say, Blantyre Mill was £30 per year. There's also strong connections with the Glasgow-West India interest in the Tory party, as it was then. And this is Colin Dunlop Donald up the top. He is the long-term secretary of the Glasgow-West India Association. And we do have, he's got strong connections with Archibald Campbell of Blytheswood, who is the Glasgow MP, pre-reform MP in the 1820s, and he is putting forward a really skewed position, really pro-slavery position, Blytheswood. We know that Colin Dunlop Donald, who is actually a solicitor, but he is campaigning and lobbying for Blytheswood. There's a reciprocal relationship going on. The Glasgow-West India interest are supporting Blytheswood, and in return Blytheswood is petitioning the pro-slavery positions in Parliament. That's actually Colin Dunlop Donald's diaries. I met his family in the 2010s and they gave me a loan of the diaries. It's probably really bad archival practice, so if there's archivists here, shut your ears. They gave me a briefcase of them. I was walking through George Square. I took them back to Lanarkshire and photographed them in my bedroom and worked in the Colin Dunlop Donald's diaries. But I mean, they're appointment diaries. And as we can see there actually isn't a lot of information beyond the simple networks. But here we can see that he canvassed for Blytheswood. We know that there's political lobbying going on. So I think just in terms of the themes, you know, the Glasgow-West India Association are clearly putting forward a pro-slavery offensive. We know the slave trade's gone in 1807, but what we do see is they react to major events like amelioration, which is ostensibly improving the lives of the enslaved people. They're representing themselves as a benevolent organisation. They're also committing funds to the Anglican Church. They're also, you know, they're representing themselves as on the side of the enslaved people, really, but we know, of course, their main agenda is to preserve chattel slavery. The system of chattel slavery is under threat probably from about 1823. That's when the next campaign for abolition kicks off with Canning's resolutions, and we heard from David earlier that Buxton takes over the second campaign from Wilberforce. But the pro-slavery propagandists, you know, they really fight a vicious battle in the 1820s. I think the question is then, is there any popular support for the pro-slavery offensives? Because we know that they tried to do this. We know this from Ian's work. The Glasgow-West India Association tried to mobilise across Scotland. You know, they tried to organise other associations. I think in Greenock there's associations. I think Edinburgh, Campbelltown, we see them writing to other organisations. They're also trying to make Scotland part of the formal British pro-slavery movement with communications with Liverpool, Bristol, and particularly London. But there's no suggestion at all that the wider Glasgow public had any, you know, pro-slavery, you know, sympathies. And sometimes you do get a source that makes you laugh, and I'll describe this one briefly. So in 1833, in the Andersonian, there was a debate about emancipation. Of course, it's the height of the emancipation debates. So the pro-slavery groups turned up, and it describes them as like sons of planters. So they turned up with sticks. The abolitionists had bigger sticks and fought back. So there's actually a riot in the Andersonian. And then there's a statement the Glasgow Courier publish on it. They say, well, you know, the pro-slavery movement is so small at this time. The Glasgow citizenry are not behind it. It's only restricted to the family of the planters and the merchants. So there's no suggestion that Glasgow is pro-slavery at that point. And we know that the West India Association do not have any, you know, wider public support. Well, I think I'm making a bit good time. I'm nearly there. Of course, we know that slavery is abolished in 1834. £20 million compensation is provided by the British government for the loss of property, the property being the lives of men, women and children enslaved. Property as a concept is, of course, sacrosanct. Even the likes of Wilberforce advocated if the British government were going to change the terms of the property, there would have to be compensation. So anybody with property like Wilberforce advocated compensation. We do see the remarkable work for legacies of British slavery. We know that very many of these Glasgow-West India Association members, they collected, I think, about £400,000 of this 20 million. So Glasgow is one of the core hubs of compensation money in the 1830s. We know this tells us that there's very many Glasgow slave owners in and around the hinterlands of the west of Scotland. The apprenticeship scheme, slavery by another name, for a further 4 years. Some final questions then. Can we really characterise Glasgow as a pro-slavery city. There's definitely the first philosophical opposition to slavery comes through Francis Hutcheson at Old College. John Miller and Adam Smith follow this in different ways through either their work or the petition that Miller signed in 1792. We know that there's widespread popular opposition to the slave trade and plantation slavery via petitions, as Ian ably described just before me. On the other hand, we have small groups of merchants and planters. They're mounting a pro-slavery offensive. We don't think there was any popular support at all. There is no suggestion of large-scale pro-slavery movement behind the West India Association. But at the same time, even if Glasgow public or the West of Scotland public are not pro-slavery in theory, I would end provocatively by posing the question, are they pro-slavery in practice? Because the leading sectors of the Scottish economy, particularly cotton and linen, 30% of the working population, their continued employment are dependent on the perpetuation of Atlantic slavery. I think I can pose the question then, why did the association not go to the cotton mills and say, well, your employment, our interests here are aligned. But of course there's a double level of Atlantic exploitation there, and sometimes the cotton mill workers characterise themselves as white slaves. So I think that's the question, was Scotland a pro-slavery nation? And I would just add some nuance to that. Thank you for listening.